Imagine an animal so poisonous that a single bite can stop a crocodile's heart, kill a python twice its size, and wipe out 90% of the predators that try to eat it. Now imagine that same animal being torn apart, piece by piece, by something smaller than your fingernail. That is exactly what is happening right now across the wetlands of northern Australia, and scientists finally caught it on camera. The predator in this story is not a bird, not a snake, not even a lizard. It is an ant, a small, red, aggressive little insect called the meat ant. And the prey is the cane toad, one of the most destructive invasive species on the entire planet. For almost a century, this toad has been unstoppable. It has poisoned its way across an entire continent while nothing native could touch it. Until now. To understand why this footage is such a big deal, you have to go back to 1935, to a sugarcane field in Gordonvale, Queensland. Farmers there were losing their crops to a beetle, and someone had an idea that sounded reasonable at the time. Bring in a toad from Central America that eats beetles, let it loose in the fields, and let nature do the pest control. It was supposed to be simple. It was supposed to be a fix. Instead, it became one of the worst ecological disasters in Australian history. Just 101 toads were released that year. The beetles they were meant to eat lived high up on the cane stalks, completely out of reach. The toads barely touched them, but those same toads discovered something far better waiting for them on the ground. An entire continent with no natural predators, endless food, and a climate they loved. Within a few decades, their numbers exploded past 5 million. Today, estimates put the population in the hundreds of millions, and the toads are still spreading, moving west and south at up to 60 kilometers a year. Here is what makes the cane toad so dangerous. Behind its head sit two swollen glands called parotoid glands. When the toad feels threatened, those glands release a thick, milky toxin called bufotoxin. This is not a mild irritant. It is a compound that attacks the heart directly, and it can kill an animal within minutes. A goanna that swallows a toad whole will often be dead before it even finishes eating. A quoll, a crocodile, a snake, none of them evolved alongside this toad, so none of them learned to avoid it. They just saw an easy meal and paid for it with their lives. The damage has been staggering. In some regions, more than 90% of northern quolls died within months of toads arriving. Freshwater crocodiles, blue-tongue skinks, and several species of monitor lizard collapsed just as fast. One long-term study tracking giant monitor lizards found populations that still had not recovered even decades after toads first moved through the area. These were not just isolated losses either. When you remove the apex predators from an ecosystem, everything below them shifts. Smaller animals that used to be kept in check suddenly multiply. Plants and insects further down the chain feel the ripple effects. Scientists call this a trophic cascade, and cane toads triggered one of the biggest examples of it that Australia has ever recorded. For decades, people tried everything to stop them. Communities organized toad musters, where volunteers would go out at night and physically collect thousands of toads to be euthanized. Some politicians even suggested beating them to death with golf clubs and cricket bats, and at least one government minister publicly endorsed the idea. None of it made a dent. You cannot club your way through 200 million toads. Scientists tried fencing, trapping, even genetically modifying tadpoles to disrupt reproduction. Every method either failed outright or only worked on a tiny local scale. The toad kept winning, generation after generation, because it had no real enemy. And that is what makes the meat ant story so remarkable. This is not a solution humans engineered in a lab. It is something that was happening quietly in the wild the entire time until a team of researchers from the University of Sydney finally noticed it. The story starts at a place called Fog Dam, a wetland in the Northern Territory that has become one of the most studied cane toad sites in the world. Researchers, including Professor Rick Shine and his student Georgia Ward-Fear, were tracking how young toads behaved after emerging from the water. What they saw near the ant nests stopped them in their tracks. Meat ants, the same aggressive territorial insects that build huge mound nests across the Australian outback, were swarming baby cane toads and killing them. Meat ants, scientifically known as Iridomyrmex purpureus, are not a rare or obscure species. Anyone who has spent time outdoors in Australia has probably seen their nests, wide dome-shaped mounds of clear dirt surrounded by a ring of pebbles and dead grass. They are known for being fiercely territorial, willing to swarm and bite anything that gets too close, including animals far larger than themselves. For most of Australian history, they were seen as little more than a nuisance. Nobody thought of them as a weapon against one of the country's worst invasive species. Here is the part that makes this so fascinating. Adult cane toads are basically untouchable. They are too big, too toxic, and too well defended. But when a cane toad is young, fresh out of the water, and barely the size of your thumbnail, it is a completely different animal. It has almost none of that thick defensive toxin built up yet. It is small, it is slow, and worst of all, it has a defense instinct that works against almost everything except ants. When most predators approach, a baby toad's first move is to freeze. That works fine against a bird or a fish looking for movement. It does not work at all against ants, which hunt by touch and scent, not sight. So the toad just sits there while the ants swarm over it. On top of that, native frogs in the same environment usually bolt away from an ant attack within about 1 second. Baby cane. Toads take almost 5 times as long to react, nearly 5 full seconds, because they never evolved alongside this particular threat. By the time it finally tries to move, it is already covered. Then there's the toxin problem, and this is where it gets almost poetic. Bufotoxin is so deadly because it targets the heart. It disrupts the electrical signals that keep a heart beating, which is why it can drop a crocodile in minutes. But ants do not have a heart in the way vertebrates do. They rely on an open circulatory system with no central pump for the toxin to meaningfully attack. In other words, the exact weapon that makes this toad nearly unkillable to almost every other predator on the continent simply does nothing to the one animal now hunting it. Once the researchers understood this, they wanted to see if they could actually use it. The idea was almost embarrassingly simple. Meat ants are drawn to protein, so the team started placing small amounts of ordinary cat food near ponds and waterholes, right where baby toads were known to emerge in huge numbers. The cat food pulled ants in from nearby nests, and once those ants were in position, they did exactly what meat ants do. They attacked anything small and slow-moving that came within range. The results were far better than anyone expected. In trial sites, meat ants killed roughly 70% of the baby toads, emerging near their nests. 70% from nothing more than a few tablespoons of cat food placed in the right spot. No traps, no chemicals, no genetic engineering. Just encouraging a predator that was already there to show up at exactly the right moment. Some researchers have even experimented with planting particular tree species near waterholes, since certain trees naturally attract meat ants to build their nests nearby, creating a longer-term version of the same effect without needing to keep placing bait. And then came the footage. This is the part that made the story spread far beyond scientific journals. Camera crews and researchers captured the attacks up close, and it is genuinely intense to watch. Dozens of meat ants converge on a single baby toad within seconds. The toad barely reacts at first, exactly as the freeze response theory predicted. Then the ants start biting, gripping onto the skin and legs with their powerful jaws, and more ants keep arriving, drawn in by the commotion. Within a couple of minutes, a toad that had no natural enemies for 80 years is being pulled apart by insects smaller than a grain of rice. It is brutal to watch, there's no getting around that. But from an ecological standpoint, it is also one of the most hopeful things researchers have filmed in this entire saga. This is not a case of humans dumping another species into the ecosystem and hoping for the best, which is literally how the toad problem started in the first place. This is a native Australian predator that was there the whole time, simply doing what it already does, and it turns out to be devastatingly effective against the one animal everyone thought was unstoppable. Of course, not everyone is convinced this solves the bigger problem. Some conservation groups have pointed out that meat ants mainly affect toads in the earliest, most vulnerable stage of life, right after they leave the water as tiny toadlets. Once a toad survives past that stage and grows larger, its toxin becomes far more concentrated, and meat ants generally leave it alone. Critics, working directly with toad control programs, have argued that in places where toad numbers are already extremely high, thinning out the babies barely puts a dent in the overall population, since so many still make it through regardless. There has also been pushback on welfare grounds. Groups like the RSPCA have raised concerns about deliberately encouraging an insect attack as a control method, arguing that researchers should focus on approaches that do not involve this kind of prolonged, visible suffering, even for an invasive species. It is a legitimate ethical debate, and scientists working on the project have generally acknowledged it rather than dismissing it outright. Still, most researchers agree this discovery matters, even if it is not a total fix on its own. Meat ants are not being proposed as the single answer that ends the toad invasion for good. They are one more tool, one more piece of a much bigger and more complicated puzzle that also includes genetic research and habitat management. What makes the ants special is that they were free, they were already native to every region toads have invaded, and they required almost no infrastructure to activate. A wildlife manager does not need a lab or a permit to place cat food near a pond. The meat ant story also isn't happening alone. It turns out cane toads are quietly running into other Australian animals that have started figuring them out too. Water rats, known locally as ricali, have learned to flip cane toads onto their backs and eat around the poison glands entirely, going straight for the heart and liver with what researchers have described as almost surgical precision. Some crows and ibises have picked up similar tricks, learning which parts of the toad are safe and which parts will kill them. None of this happened overnight. It took decades of trial and error and plenty of dead birds and rats along the way. before these behaviors spread through local populations. What ties all of these stories together is something researchers call evolutionary rescue. When an invasive species arrives, native animals do not just sit there and accept extinction. Over enough generations, the ones that happen to avoid the danger, whether through instinct, learning, or pure luck, survive and pass that advantage on. Slowly, populations start adapting. It is not fast, and for many species, it comes far too late to prevent serious losses. But it is happening, and the meat ant footage is one of the clearest, most visual examples of that process caught on camera. There is also a strange kind of justice in how this particular story plays out. The original plan back in 1935 was to import one animal to fix a problem, and it turned into one of the biggest ecological disasters the country has ever seen. Nearly 90 years later, the fix isn't coming from another imported species or a lab-engineered solution. It is coming from an ant that has been living in that same landscape the entire time, doing exactly what it has always done, just now aimed at exactly the right target. If you're enjoying stories like this, hit like and subscribe, because there is a lot more strange and fascinating wildlife science where this came from. Scientists are now exploring whether this same approach could be scaled up deliberately, placing bait stations near known toad breeding sites during the exact weeks when toadlets emerge in mass numbers. Early trials suggest the timing matters enormously. Get the ants in position during that narrow window when toads are small, slow, and freezing instead of fleeing, and the kill rate stays high. Miss that window, and the toads grow past the size where ants pose any real threat, and the whole strategy loses most of its effectiveness. There's also growing interest in combining this with other strategies already in development, including so-called Peter Pan tadpoles, genetically modified toad tadpoles designed to disrupt the reproduction and development of the wider population without introducing yet another foreign species into the mix. Combined with predators like meat ants picking off survivors at the toadlet stage, researchers hope to finally start bending the population curve downward instead of just watching it keep climbing year after year. It is worth remembering just how rare a genuine success story is in the world of invasive species management. Most control efforts fail quietly, buried in research papers nobody outside the field ever reads. Budgets run out, populations rebound, and the invader simply outlasts every attempt to slow it down. The cane toad has beaten almost every method thrown at it for nearly 90 straight years. That track record is exactly why a 70% kill rate using nothing more than cat food and a native ant has generated so much genuine excitement among ecologists who are usually much more cautious about celebrating early results. None of this means the cane toad problem is solved. 200 million toads do not disappear because of one clever discovery involving cat food and ants. But for the first time in a very long while, the story out of northern Australia isn't just about another species losing the fight. It's about the ecosystem starting to fight back on its own terms, using a predator that was there all along, waiting for someone to finally notice what it could do. To really appreciate how unusual this outcome is, it helps to look at Australia's long, mostly painful history with introduced species in general. The cane toad was not the first time someone tried to fix one problem by bringing in a new animal, and it was not the last. Rabbits were brought over in the 1800s for hunting and quickly became one of the most destructive pests in the country's history, stripping vegetation bare across huge stretches of land. Foxes and cats were introduced around the same era and went on to devastate native bird and mammal populations that had never faced that kind of predator before. In almost every case, the pattern repeats itself. An animal arrives with no natural checks on its population, and by the time anyone realizes the mistake, it is already too widespread to remove. What sets the meat ant discovery apart is that it did not add a new variable to that equation. It did not risk becoming the next unintended disaster, the way a poorly planned biological control agent so often does. The ants were already fully integrated into the ecosystem, filling their ordinary role long before cane toads ever arrived. Researchers did not introduce a new predator. They simply learned how to nudge an existing one toward a target it was already fully capable of handling on its own. That distinction matters enormously to conservation scientists, because history has shown just how badly things can go when humans try to engineer a fix without fully understanding the consequences. The cane toad itself is the textbook example. It was supposed to eat a beetle problem. Instead, it created a much larger one that took nearly a century to even begin correcting. Every serious researcher working on this issue today is acutely aware of that history, which is part of why a low-risk, low-cost, already native solution like the meat ant carries so much weight, even if its impact is limited to one narrow stage of the toad's life cycle. The team behind the discovery has continued expanding the research well beyond that first observation at Fog Dam. Follow-up studies have looked at how far meat ant colonies need to be from a waterhole to have a meaningful effect, how quickly ants respond, to bait during different seasons, and whether repeated exposure trains ants to seek out toadlets even without the cat food as a lure. Some of that work has suggested that once ants learn to associate the area around a pond with an easy food source, they keep patrolling it even after the bait is gone, effectively turning the pond edge into a permanent kill zone for any toad small enough to be vulnerable. There's also ongoing work looking at whether this method could eventually be paired with community and citizen science programs, the same volunteers who once spent their evenings on toad musters, swinging nets and buckets. Instead of manually collecting toads one at a time, communities living near known breeding sites could potentially be trained to identify meat ant nests, monitor toadlet, emergence timing, and place bait at exactly the right moment each season. It would not require specialized equipment or funding on the scale of a genetic engineering program. It would mostly require knowing when and where to look, which is exactly the kind of information this research has been building up. There is even talk among some researchers of mapping meat ant nest density across the entire toad invasion front, using that data to predict which waterholes will naturally see high toadlet mortality and which ones might need a helping hand with bait stations. It is the kind of unglamorous, patient science that rarely makes headlines on its own. Yet it is exactly the sort of groundwork that turns a lucky observation into a repeatable, scalable strategy. None of this erases the scale of what cane toads have already done to Australian wildlife. Species like the northern quoll have been pushed to the edge of extinction in some regions. There is no version of this story where meat ants alone bring those populations roaring back. The toads that already survived past the toadlet stage, the ones spreading further west and south every year, remain largely immune to this particular threat. The invasion front is still moving, the toxin is still lethal. The overall population is still measured in the hundreds of millions. But ecology rarely moves in single dramatic victories. It moves through exactly this kind of incremental discovery, one predator, one behavior, one narrow but real advantage stacked on top of another, slowly shifting the balance over years and decades rather than overnight. Meat ants killing toadlets, water rats learning to eat around the poison glands, ibises figuring out which parts of the toad are safe, genetically modified tadpoles disrupting reproduction. All of it adds up. None of these pieces alone would stop the invasion. Together, they represent the first real signs that the balance might eventually start tilting the other way. And that, more than anything, is why this tiny ant and its brutal, effective hunting footage has captured so much attention. It's not just a viral clip of insects attacking a toad. It's a glimpse of nature quietly working out its own solution to a problem humans created almost a century ago, one tiny, poison-proof predator at a time. So next time someone tells you the little guy never wins, just remember, in the wetlands of northern Australia, the smallest animal in the room just took down the toad nothing else could touch.